Welcome, Minoo. I'm Frances Hasso, as you know, and this is Minoo Moallem. But before I delve into into the discussion with our wonderful guest, Minoo Moallem, I do want to encourage folks to subscribe to the East is a podcast on Patreon. Um, it's not expensive. It's important to support production of the program by Sina Rahmani and well worth it, I have found. For as little as $5 a month, you get to support the public content and get access to hundreds of hours of bonus content. I've been a Patreon for about 2 years and especially love the regular RSS feeds of audio content. Um, so that's that. And what I'd like to do now with Professor Moallem, who I'll call Minoo because we're friends, is to ask you to introduce yourself and share with the audience some of your background in research and activism, whatever whatever you like. And we're very flexible on time.
Great. Thank you, Francis, for asking me to get involved in this conversation. It's really delightful to talk to you each time we get together and talk about various issues. And I highly recommend this podcast. This is fantastic. And so hopefully we have a good conversation. So I was born and raised in Iran and then became politicized very early at the age of 12 and started to really identify with various social movements. But basically, I started to read a lot. By the age of 18, I read about the Chinese Revolution, Russian Revolution, Ho Chi Minh, Sun Yat-sen, Patrice Lumumba. So, and then, Ali Shariati, Frantz Fanon. Even before I went to university, then I got accepted to Tehran University as three ranked, higher ranked students. And I actually chose only social sciences and philosophy as my choices. And I got accepted, and then I did a BA and MA at Tehran University and worked at the Institute for Social Research when I was an MA student. So my minor was economy, and I took my studies very seriously, as well as, I was a rebellious child. I would challenge social norms. And of course, when I learned that, when I became more and more invested in the ideas of social change, I started to find role models. And those anti-colonial women who were fighting on the streets, like Bernadette Dublin, who was a young woman at that time in Ireland, Jamile Bou-Pasha in Algeria, Leila Khaled, they all became women who went beyond the boundaries of gender issues. So the moment I learned that the normative ideas of gender are not necessarily, those that are inscribed on our bodies are not necessarily something we have to live with. So it was a it was a liberating moment, a moment where I kind of, later on theorized and, argued that kind of nothing in humans is stable, and then stability is something that we gain through our bodies, as they're produced historically and politically, and bodies are open to historical molding. So that was a moment where my relationship changed. Then I participated in the Iranian Revolution of 1979. At that time, I was working in a poor neighborhood, and I was teaching women how to read and write, and basically how to sign their contracts and so on. And then during the revolution, as many Iranian women, I participated in the revolution and experienced a total collapse of institutions after the revolution for a year or so, which was really amazing and an experience I would never forget, because it was a time where we started to generate our ideas, we started to have political discussions, and we started to buy books that were prohibited. Like we all got like multiple versions of Marx's Capital, or so everything that was prohibited, like in Iran. And so that was a wonderful time. And then the Iran-Iraq war started, and the situation got a little more complicated. And then I felt that, leaving Iran was much more helpful in my own case. So I left Iran in 1982, and then I became diasporic. Of course, diaspora changes you, dislocation changes you. You actually, the loss of homeland, and the experience of homelessness is unsettling, and you never know if you can survive. Survival is not evident. However, I think I had some class resources and so on that helped me in this process. And then I applied to do a PhD when I moved to Canada from France. I started to work on really questions of race, immigration, dislocation, it's just, and so on. I was exposed to feminist ideas, gender ideas in Iran. And however, I think my theoretical grounding happened in Paris and Montreal and so on. So it was like a part of what I learned. And also I went back a lot when we were discussing race to understand race in the context of colonialism, because my experience of race was not just related to dislocation, was also what I experienced as a woman in a semi-colonized country, because Iran has never been directly colonized. However, it has been colonized through a few things, even though some parts of Iran were occupied. Let's say Bushehr was in the south of Iran, was occupied by British several times. And then Azerbaijan, Mahabad was occupied by Russians. So in a sense, we had that form of occupation. However, what the form of colonialism in Iran was more through what I have called civilizational imperialism, and which is functioning more culturally, more through ideas of modernization and so on. And so in a sense, I started to understand my location as a racialized subject, but this racialization was connected with my experience of being in Iran and going through the project of modernization, civilization, or imperialism, and so on. So then I started really to work on questions of immigration, and then after that I went to UC Berkeley as a postdoctoral fellow, and started to really, I wrote my PhD dissertation in French, and then I switched to English. And then the result of my postdoctoral years and my professorship and so on was the book that I published in 2005. So anyhow, that is if you have any specific questions, the story is long, but
Yeah. I know, no, and there is time. There is time. Can you actually, since that's my exposure, my initial exposure to your work, can you just give an overview of the That's the 2005 book.
Yes. So as I said, my dissertation was one of the first dissertation I could say, which engaged with what we call questions of intersectionality. But I called it in French questions of articulation, articulation, les rapports sociaux. So it was one of the first dissertation that actually thought about what happens when we think of class, race, gender at the same time. So, and then because it was French, and I was not able to publish it because I moved to the US, and then I published several articles based on that, and I did a guest editing volume on Iranian exiles and refugees, and did an introduction to transnational immigration studies, what we mean by that, and so on. So, and then I started to really go back to when I was more prepared to the experience of Iran. I was very frustrated with the feminist literature and with the literature on Iran. And it seemed to me that two areas were missing from the literature. One area was really bringing Iranian studies into conversation with post-colonial studies, because most Iranian scholars argue that Iran has not been colonized. We cannot actually engage with post-colonial studies, and my argument was absolutely not. We have to. And as you see now, you see that what are the consequences of not engaging with questions of colonialism and imperialism and the impact of that on. And then the other frustration with the literature was that the literature was taking constantly this Enlightenment, modernist approach to the Iranian history, right? So the enlightened modernity, and then the Iranian state and the Iranian revolution and so on. And my take was completely different. My take was that, what we call tradition was reinvented actually in Iran. And then I went specifically to show how modernization and civilizational imperialism function. And for the first time, I studied the discourse of Orientalism vis-a-vis Iran. It's my book, or maybe the first and the only one, which actually engages with the discourse of Orientalism and shows how Orientalism was specific vis-a-vis Iran. For example, one component of the discourse of colonialism or Orientalism vis-a-vis Iran was that, Iranians were civilized before they adopted Islam. So, and then of course, the modernist state was completely invested in that, and they actually, that is how actually Reza Shah became also invested in Nazi ideas of Aryanism, that we were an Aryan nation and we were kind of civilized, and so, and the ideas of anti-Arab and the whole colonial project of divide and rule between Turkey, Iran, and the Arab world functioned in that sense. So, so I started to really understand the Iranian modernity and post-modernity through that kind of intense research, reading and writing and engaging with the images, and also bringing my own experience of being someone who participated in my view, still in one of the most important revolutions of 20th century, along with China and Mexico and many anti-colonial revolutions. So I think it was a privilege to be part of that and to think carefully about what happened, especially as a gendered person, as somebody who is not only subjected to the coloniality of power in terms of, class and, religion and so on, but also to gender and sexuality issues. So that actually enabled me to think through the book. And at that time I was also very much invested in feminist cultural studies. I thought that even though I had a very good knowledge of class relations and Frankfurt School and Marxist theories and so on, I became way more invested in the ideas of culture and the importance of culture and various notions of culture, and how meaning making actually is crucial, how questions of representation and so on and so forth. So I think that is why I use lots of materials like, films, media, murals and so on during the time of revolution, to understand what happened. Because massive women participated in the Iranian Revolution of 1979. They were not necessarily homogeneous, right? Some were leftists, some were, Muslim, Islamist women, some were kind of more invested in Islamic nationalism or secular nationalism. We were all kinds of women, all kind of women participated. And then, even women in villages, workers, they all participated in some fashion in the revolution. So I think that was something I wanted to understand, what made me leave Iran, and how women who stayed are engaged with what was going on. So in a sense, I never felt that, I went against the whole idea of liberating the other or liberating the Iranian women. I thought, I'm dislocated, and many women are in Iran, and we are all working to challenge gender issues and patriarchal issues and class issues. So in that sense, there is I'm a kind of a humble educator and not a liberator in a sense. So that is why I think I take my academic work very seriously, and I think my writing, my presence in the classroom, working with the students and so on is so meaningful and so important for me. Because in a sense, I think during the Iranian Revolution, many of us wanted the dictatorship to go away. However, the ideas of what we wanted was not very clear, right? And I think it's crucial for anyone who thinks about social change to know exactly what is it that they want, what is it that we want to happen, and so on. And I think, that is the story of the book. But the book has a lot of theoretical articulations. However, Francis, as you know, when we talk about theory, as area studies people, we are supposed to do the area studies. We are not doing theory. And that has been a frustrating experience for me, because my book might be read in the context of Iran, but it's not read as a feminist theory book, right? So, which makes me even more frustrated after so many years when I go back to the book and I feel that, and I see that, it's still, area studies people. We are doing theory here and you are doing, experience. So,
Right. As soon as it's framed as simply experience, we're like raw material. We're not doing it, it's as if we're not doing the same amount of work. And yeah, it's the and I do think this is about imperialism and the way, colonialism and the ways in which many of us migrate. And we often migrate to the imperialist cores and the knowledge systems. why wouldn't they? I mean, the knowledge systems reproduce those relations, and yeah, and you and I know this because we've both been involved in what's called transnational feminist scholarship, but and there's a number of other scholars in that field, and I mean, as Leila Fernandez has also shown, that field is about the United States too. It's about us inserting in the margins, trying to dislocate. But for me, like a materialist kind of anti-imperialist analysis, a historical analysis, has helped me to understand how difficult it actually is because the ideological and material interests are pretty powerful in our institutions. I mean, but it's still frustrating
Yes, I think
because you
it's just,
begin thinking, yeah, go ahead.
yeah, but you know, Francis, you're right. But it's not only the kind of imperialism, there's also the patriarchal elite, intellectual elite, that are very dismissive of the scholarship of women who are challenging, challenging their framework. And it's just really interesting. And if we are domesticated and docile scholars, everybody loves us. But what if we kind of go beyond that and we take a more complicated, also doing theory, always, people would say, oh, this is too theoretical, this is jargony. And, as if we are not, as scholars, as intellectuals, we are not supposed to play with theory. We are not supposed to theorize. We are not supposed to contribute to theories. So, in a sense, the theory becomes a taboo for scholars of non-white scholars, and especially scholars from the third world, right? It's just it's and made our male intellectuals are as dismissive as like the coloniality of knowledge. They're um, um, as they're also an obstacle. And so that is a problem. And I can, it's very crucial for me to, that is why I always think of, we have, as transnational feminist scholars, we have a number of tasks that are complicated and entangled with each other, right? It's constantly going against patriarchy and patriarchal relations, patriarchal culture that are sometimes very subtle, but they're existing in our institutions, right? So the idea of trust and citations and the politics, for example, politics of citation. So we are
That's
constantly,
one of my big that's a powerful that is a powerful dismissive because I always think about politics. We're not allowed to talk what I say, what I call politics with a big P. We're just allowed to talk politics with a little p, like agency, ethnographic, that stuff. It's quaint. We're ghettoized into the quaint and as if they're also not quaint. But some questions are, yeah, there is a gender logic to who's authorized to ask and address certain questions. And for me, in a multi-scalar way, like it's always multi-scalar, but and no, I have nothing against ethnographic work. I have done it. We've all done it, but we integrate it into really big questions. And yeah, so I completely, go ahead.
understand it. To go back to the context of the book, we are writing against an established way of doing knowledge, right? and as feminists, as transnational scholars, as so we are writing against a huge body of legitimate literature, and that becomes a really a challenge. And so it's just it's very interesting. So very interesting to think about that. So, however, I always challenge the whole language of victimhood, and try to do something that is probably unpopular. And I have been trying to cross those borders and those boundaries, and take I took a lot of risk in my scholarship. I didn't go by safely doing a scholarship, right? When I wanted, maybe I don't know if I want to keep this, but when I wanted to publish my dissertation in French, I was told that you should write it, you should channel it towards Muslim women. And the dissertation was not about, it was about Iranian immigrants, Muslim, non-Muslim, all of them. So it is just the desire to contain you, so is very strong, and I think that has been a constant effort on my part to go beyond that. Because even when I was writing my second book, the Persian carpet book, I remember I went to the library to look for sources, and we had a librarian who kind of surprisingly looked at me and said, "Are you writing about Persian carpets? Aren't you a feminist? Don't you work on feminist issues?" As if working on Persian carpet was not a feminist project. So it's just, and but I took the risk. I went for that, and I did that, and so that is what I mean. That to be safe is very appreciated, but to go beyond the boundaries of safety, to take risk, to really homeless yourself or dislocate yourself within the literature is a challenge. And we are not permitted to go for that challenge by various forces that are around us. But I think, you know, I took that risk, and I'm happy about that. So,
And yeah, and it was well worth it, right? There's like a legibility. Uh, it's like the market, the category, it's constant, how to I think containing is a really good verb for it. And I think it's material, it's ideological, and it's related to rewards, right? What is rewarded? I have a friend who and colleague who was probably quoting something else, but the metaphor that he used was, you have a bologna, the meat, and what you're really encouraged to do is really slice it very, very thinly, and just keep producing, uh, yeah, keep producing publication wise around like thin slices of bologna. And the system is that's what it rewards. And then some people, they often are men of multiple ethnic backgrounds, are allowed to write make a big piece of bologna. I used to work in a deli, so it's also kind of phallic because a piece of bologna kind of, yeah, looks phallic. And so, but there are, and you're then allowed to really write in very broad strokes, and there isn't always the same, there aren't always the same restrictions on sourcing and right, the evidence and things like that. I actually appreciate when they're well done, those kinds of texts, but not all of us are authorized to make those kinds of claims. So, and yeah.
Yes, the other point is when you are a multilingual scholar, right? And you move between different languages, right? It becomes even more challenging, but also your body, as you know, my body as a dislocated body is connected to various locations, right? Don't ask me to nationalize my body because it's dislocated, but also connected to various nations, right? So when, George Floyd is being, harassed by the police, is part of your body is being there, right? Not, but you identify with that when, you know, people in Iran die of cancer without of horrible sanctions. Part of me is kind of not experiencing, but identifying with that. So in a sense, we are kind of also connected to various locations, various languages, and we carry metaphors from one language to another, and that makes it, in my view, is actually, it has contributed to richness for me, richness of a scholarship. However, you are also struggling with, two, three different systems, cultural ideas, and so
Yeah,
on.
I mean, I would just say for you and also for me, we want, we refuse to, we want to speak also intellectually and politically and creatively to multiple audiences, including the places that we have attachments to that are beyond, the diasporic location. And so that also, I mean, and that is not to underestimate or speak down to any audience, but we do tend to, uh, that's not an important criteria for how we're evaluated in Western academies, how we write, that we actually are interested. I often think in another language, even as I'm writing in English, and even though, it wasn't always the case, but English is my main language now, but I still, my brain is uh is actually thinking in, yeah,
Yes, Arabic.
sorry.
Yes.
Yeah, so I
So, but also
completely,
you see, the students, all the area studies at least ask the students to learn languages, right? As problematic as they were, right? But however, these days with social media and Google and everything else, the desire for language learning has reduced, and it's everything that bring to the context of English is that it goes through a form of translation, and sometimes it becomes really, we lose the meaning in one language when we bring it to another language. So there are issues that we need to think carefully when we play with words, and we try to bring it into the context of English or French, or, even going back to Farsi for me is the same. I've been far from Farsi, everyday Farsi, and then going back to that, it's a challenge again. So in a sense, like many post-colonial scholars, we are living in this hybrid context where ideas are moving from one, and that is the meaning of transnationalism, right? The movement of ideas, capital, labor, bodies across the world. So, in a sense, that is also part and parcel of what we do, how we become, and what kind of scholars we become. So,
So since you mentioned your book, Persian Carpets, the full title is Persian Carpets, the Nation as a Transnational Commodity. I thought we could move to that um, for a bit. I found it fascinating and wonder if you can outline its focus and argument for people who didn't read it like I did. And I just read it on a long airplane ride, not that long. I found it a very beautiful read. I was particularly struck by your examination of war carpets and wonder if you can give us an overall sense of the focus and argument, and then if you can talk about the war carpets dimension of it.
You see, when I was finishing my first book, Between Warrior Brother and Veiled Sister, I came across two commodities that became really important in early 20th century in Iran. One was the carpet and the other was oil. So as I show it in the book, the
The
colonial
carpet
map,
and the what? What was this?
the oil,
What was the second
petroleum,
thing?
oil,
Oh,
oil,
yes, oil. Oil. How can we
petroleum.
forget? Yes, okay.
Yes.
Yes.
So, and then, I thought, okay, this is so interesting that, in early 20th century, Iran had to identify with these two commodities, and the colonial maps, the British maps, would actually have some maps showing where was the location of the carpet and the oil. So then, after finishing that book, I said, this is something I would like to study. And basically, the book had, I started to work on that. I started with a digital project that was supported by the University of Southern California, and the project is online. Is still online. People can read it. It's called Nation on the Move. But the digital media project enabled me to bring text, sound, and theory into conversation with each other. So it was very liberating in a sense from writing a book. So, and that actually made me more interested in the ideas of image and films and so on and so forth. So then I wanted to this time, and I was also frustrated with feminist literature on Persian, on carpet weavers. They were always represented as this ultimate victims of patriarchy and so on and so forth. And I thought, okay, how about what if we start with the object, with the carpet, and just not go, not do any human centered work? Even though when I was going back to Iran, I would go to the villages, I would sit with women, I would talk with women, but I didn't want it to be the center of my work. So then I started to follow the carpet. So, for example, I would go to a carpet archive in a small town in England. And then from there, wherever I was sent to, I would go to that. That's why I methodologically talk about using extension. I argue that you are in a site and you're working on that, and then your site get extended to another site transnationally. So it was so interesting. That was really, the carpet took me to many places. It took me to the villages, it took me to various archives, to museums, to the bazaar in Iran, to the kind of shops of carpet dealers in Turkey, in Iran, in France, in Paris, in California. So it kind of, so it had that dimension. And my work on the Persian carpet is, maybe, if it's not, if I can't be humble about that. It's one of the first books that actually goes with the commodity, with the carpet, and also brings gender issues into conversation with carpet. So And then, the idea was not to do a historical work on the carpet, right? There are lots of historical work, but I started to really become interested in a genealogical approach, genealogical in its Foucauldian sense, meaning that how and why a commodity becomes, we start to emphasize a commodity. A commodity, for example, Iranians were producing lots of commodities like silk, cotton, and all of a sudden, carpet becomes one of the most important commodities. Why? I was asking why carpet. So that genealogical approach helped me to really look at the context within which carpet became. We started to invest value in carpet, right? So, for example, I discovered that through my research, actually nobody has paid attention to the connoisseur literature as a form of literature that creates meaning and creates value that is invested in a commodity, right? Then I started to read, all the 350, maybe 400 books of connoisseurs in French, in English, in Farsi, and they were all kind of referring to each other. So they create a world, the world of Persian carpet, and the Persian carpet is invested with value, right? Then, of course, it's I moved with the ideas, with Marx's idea of commodity fetishism, like the fact that commodity, the moment it gets abstracted and circulated, then the questions of labor are suppressed and subordinated to that. So, and then we start invest value in that, and I go by Appadurai's theorization of value. When value invested in an object, then it gets to be exchanged in the market and so on. So that was one important aspect of the book. And so I really wanted to understand how commodity came into historical being, in which ways its meaning changed, and why today they still have this huge kind of affective, or oratic objecthood. So, and then, it was really interesting. From there, from connoisseur books, I discovered that actually Orientalism, while Edward Said, as you know, very extensively elaborate on the concept of Orientalism, but there's less about objects that are being Orientalized, like Persian carpet. And then I go very extensively into the discussion of Orientalia objects that are being invested with Orientalist ideas, that are being, considered or being represented as mysterious, and so on and so forth. So that was also really interesting to understand it. Then also another intention in the book is really to bring it into conversation culture with economy, right? So I wanted to go beyond commodity fetishism, even though I started with that, right? But I really wanted to understand how an erotic object functions, how an object becomes a site of memory, how, I call Persian carpet a mnemonic, object, an object that provokes memory, or objects that could be sacred, like, the prayer carpet. And then I started to understand that actually, reading more and more about history, that actually the first computers were designed after carpet looms, And that history is being silenced because it's weaving is something that women do, and it's still being kept as it is. So, and the history of carpet and computers is not told together. So part of it also is to show how these two histories are connected with each other. But then, those connoisseur books turn carpet into a primitive commodity, right? An orientalized commodity, a mysterious commodity, right? A flying carpet, right? So you have tons of movies that are working with that. So, and then, to go to questions of labor, even though I interviewed many women, I found out that actually women carpet weavers are being represented constantly through several images. And the images are mostly taken from the back, right? Women and children sitting at the loom and weaving. And that was in connoisseur books, in carpet selling website, and so on and so forth. And I started to really interrogate that image. So why and how we make carpet weavers into a spectacle of victimhood, right? And then I came across a lot of writing in early 20th century on carpet weavers and their pain and so on and so forth. However, it's at the time we are writing about carpet weavers and their pain and so on, the carpet industry is being transformed and become toxic, because then we start to introduce artificial and chemical dyes that is having huge impact on the health of workers. And while we are talking about this, victims stuck at the loom, we are contaminating the whole industry, and the whole industry is that. So this was really something that I wanted to challenge, that those images are really, what is it that they are revealing, what is it that they are hiding, and why and how they are connected to kind of discourses and practices at a particular context. I also wanted to show how colonialism in the context of Iran worked. I wanted to show how, let's say, the carpet industry, the colonial relationships with British worked through treaties, through unfair relationships, through multinational corporations, until Iranians became more and more conscious about carpet as something, as a national thing, right? And there is an episode of a film where that during Reza Shah, the famous Iranian painter Kamal al-Mulk was exiled to a small village. And in the small village, it was a carpet weaving village, and he came into contact with the carpet weavers and started to really appreciate the beauty of the carpet. And I call it a moment of national consciousness. Then he says, look, we have been looking on the walls for beauty, and the beauty is underneath our feet. So it's just really interesting, and the transformation of it as a colonial object, as an Oriental, into a national object. And also, I think it's just the relationships, how it worked, and also how in the case of carpet was not nationalized as such, like oil during, in the 50s. And the transformation of power happened in a very subtle way, meaning that the local elite, male elite, actually was pretty protective of the networks and never opened it up to the British, even though they established even factories in Iran. So, and then when they took over, the male elite still had the control over networks, informal networks of carpet weaving, which would go from, households in the villages to small factories to again the big factories and so on. So it's just still, the carpet industry. Then I call it really the convergence of informal imperialism and the kind of class, the nationalist class relations. So it's just how they kind of worked with each other in this process, and at the same time how Persian carpet became a commodity.
Yeah, I just before you go to the war carpets, can you? I have so many little questions, but one of them that's maybe little, I don't know if it's small, is the connection you were making between computing
Yes,
and can you elaborate on that? Because I was curious. I'm curious
yes.
what you meant.
Yeah, you see that, the first computer was a carpet loom, right? It was Babette computer in France, and that for the first time he introduced the digital carpet making. And then the more sophisticated computers were built upon that. And if you look at the language of computers, they're exactly the language of carpet weaving, like threads, webs, so on and so forth. So many are shared in carpet weaving and in computer. So, and then computers are, you know, um, are virtual, right? Are virtual screens, and carpets are virtual screens, because you look at a carpet and you can virtually read the stories. You can think about the stories. And also, in terms of labor, it's a labor that is connected to a network of people. When I ask, women, why you're learning carpet weaving, it's a hard work. Why you're teaching your little girls to, they said, because once you know carpet weaving and you go to another village and another city, you're never alone. You connect immediately with a network of people who are doing carpet. And actually, it was a very important lesson to learn that actually it was that kind of networking that was. And when you use prayer carpet for praying for namaz, you could always imagine in a spiritual world, carpet becomes a screen where you kind of imagine in the spiritual world, a paradise and so on and so forth, that, many carpets are depicting. So in a sense, there are lots of commonalities. And if we were to do a feminist history of technology, we would have brought these two together more substantially than kind of talking about computer as if they have nothing to do with the culture of carpet weaving, with the technology of weaving, with carpets as a digital screen, and so on and so forth. So it's just, I did a chapter on that. And if you go to my digital project, you can see also how I juxtapose these two things together. And yeah, the history of technology is written from masculinist perspectives. And those masculinist perspectives are always dismissive of women's work and women's contribution and women's way of dealing with technology. And I went to visit the Museum of Computer in San Jose, and the only place you see women is women as secretaries, right? There is no trace of women's contribution to that. And it's just if we don't do it as feminist scholars, we don't understand that, we don't go for those links, it's our kind of masculinist history of technology continue to be that. And there is a lot that I learned through this project. So this was one aspect of that. And there are images that, yes,
No, keep going. I have another question too,
yes,
but
no, no,
keep
continue,
finish your
continue.
thought.
I'm good. I talk too much, so.
No, no, actually, it's incredible, Minu. No, I want you to keep going. So it reminded me, so a few years ago, we bought a carpet in Istanbul that was seemed to have been made in the 40s or 50s. It wasn't a new carpet, but I learned there that the word is kilim for kilim. Okay, so now in listening to you, I was wondering if it's like related to kalam, to words. I actually don't know. And then I was just wondering if you knew, and also what word is used for what's the Persian or Farsi, word. Yeah, I had never thought about that.
Yes, carpet is a very complex object, right? It's an object of art, it's a commodity, it's a craft, it's a lot of things, and it's very hybrid. If you were to read the symbolism of carpet, they're going from all over the Central Asia, and so many parts of Asia is involved in that there are cloths from China, they're just really hybrid texts. So, and then to respond to your question, the word in Farsi for carpet is ghali, and for a smaller carpet is ghaliche, and for gleam is gleam is gleam. Gleam is very different from carpets. Carpets have knots, and Persian carpets have so many knots that makes them very refined. That is, the more refined they are, the more knots they have, and it takes a long time to do each row of the carpet. It takes a long time, but there is a carpet culture which is really amazing and interesting, because women weavers improvise songs. I for a while, when I was a student at Tehran University, I collected their songs, and the songs is about the labor process, the brutality of the boss and the carpet owners and so on. So fascinating, rapping, like they rap throughout, even though sometimes also they sing because they want to work, they collaborate with each other, and they give each other a sign that no, it's you have to integrate a pink thread. So it's just there are lots of songs. There's a culture around that. Around that. But what I argue here, that again is important, is that Marx talks about value, exchange value, and use value. But I talk also about non-value in my book. And that I learned it from my participation in the workshops, because of course, women work and their labor is one aspect that leads to the production of the carpet. But then there is another form of labor that is completely subsumed and suppressed, and that is the work of taking care of children, taking care of the yard work, vegetation, helping the sick, helping the older people. And so that is being, in my view, as non-value, because the value of labor, of course, invested in the carpet. Carpet becomes a commodity, a fetish separated from the labor, but also even the labor is not articulated completely in the carpet, because part of that labor does not produce value. It produces use value but never exchange value, right? It doesn't get to the market. It doesn't even become part of the commodification and so on so forth. So that was really an interesting theoretical moment for me, that this is going beyond use value and exchange value. There is also non-values. It's something that doesn't get into is not getting to the commodity, does not become a commodity, so but gets to be used immediately. So that was really interesting for me to see, because when I was talking to the weavers, they would say, if you look at the back of the carpet, and it's very important, because if you want to buy a carpet, I became also a little connoisseur of the carpet, you have to look at the back of the carpet and the number of knots and how original the carpet is and so on. And then they said something else. They said, look at the back of the carpet, and if there are ties that are not, knots that are not tied very well, or there are problems, that is when somebody was sick, somebody was going through divorce, somebody had it was just so interesting that you could look at the back of the carpet and then, think about all these stories and those moments of imperfection that make the carpet a luxury because of those moments of imperfection. Because, machine-made carpets are perfect because the machine does its job. But the human labor is always there. You live a life, right? So, and then it was so interesting. Now I'm kind of as interested in the back of the garden carpets as well as the front or the interface of the carpet.
Thank you. So I don't know if I interrupted you earlier, so keep
No, no, no.
going.
That's what. There's so many aspects, but I want to answer to your question about war carpets. War carpets, again, I found out that militarism and consumerism are very much, theoretically are very much integrated with each other, right? So the violence of this process is sometimes it's gentle and nice and kind, and it's gone through Orientalia, the ideas of Orientalist, Orientalist objects like carpet, flying carpet, and so on and so forth. But sometimes they're harsh, like they're depicting war and militarism. And when I came across these war carpets that are being produced in Afghanistan and now in Pakistan and sometimes in Central Asia. So they're called crazy carpets, or they're called war carpets, and so on and so forth. And I call them, they're converging with other objects that are, that are militaria. I would call them militaria, like, bombs and weapons and so on and so forth. And they are kind of they're part of the kind of network centered of war. And so these carpets actually are beautifying and aestheticizing the military artillery, like, various one of them, and they started to be produced in Afghanistan and Pakistan in refugee camps. But those who buy them mostly are people from Canada and the US, and also lots of military people who went to Afghanistan are consumers of these carpets, which is really, again, psychoanalytically interesting And then these carpets are being exhibited, not in the third world, but in Canada and the US. And I thought very carefully and deeply about what it means for the carpets, which was always depicting the nature and maybe a romantic notion of the nature in peace and harmony and so, to become a reflection of the war and militarism and destruction and bombs and weapons and so on. And I think war carpets are binding the paradoxical presence of a panoptic space of production in the war zone and a decorative, spectacular aestheticization of war in the consumptive zones. So in a sense, it's just interesting. Then I went back a lot to Marx's conceptualization of productive consumption versus consumptive production, how consumerism provoke certain kind of production that actually maybe Marx elaborated himself way more on the productive consumption than consumptive production, even though the few chapters in Capital are amazing and it's so important. However, I think the focus is much more on productive consumption, but he talks about consumptive production, So, and I think this is this is something that consumerism actually creates a desire for producing those carpets. So, just a really interesting area of and the images are powerful, really powerful images. That if we think of carpets as a mnemonic objects, as a mnemonic commodity, then it's also about memorizing a war and occupation and this destruction of the landscape. It's not only just occupation, but destroying the landscape of Afghanistan, first by Soviets and then by Americans, and now, we supported Taliban's, and then now we are kind of handing in Afghanistan. It shows the horror of war and occupation and imperialism, and that we have a tendency to forget. We have a tendency to forget what happened in Iraq. We have a tendency to forget what happened in Afghanistan. Sometimes when I teach my course, Women in the Muslim and Arab World, and I get someone from the military, and I see that the post-traumatic stress emerges in the classroom, reading about Afghanistan and so on. But it's just, we forget so fast, even in the third world, even in Iran, we forget so fast what is meant by occupation, what is meant by a war. It's not just, a war is interrupting. A war is brutal. A war is violent for women. A lot of violence take place in the context of war, especially vis-a-vis women. So, anyhow.
Yes. No, thank you for like excavating or working through your own genealogy and of the carpet. I have more questions. I have many post-its on the table now. So what I thought I would do now is just ask you, in October 21, you published an essay in Meridians titled Race, Gender, and Religion, Islamophobia and Beyond. And you discuss the fetishization of Islam and how Western colonialist and imperialist forces representationally connect that with the image of the veiled woman, and in turn, so do Muslim majority societies in the modern period, as we know, and not only in Iran. And I was struck by the final sentence in the essay where you say, and I quote, to challenge Islamophobia, one must deconstruct not only the geopolitics, but also the body politics of coloniality and its knowledge frames within global political society and specific nation states, unquote. And I was hoping you could elaborate on the fetishization point and the other ideas that you're capturing in that sentence.
Yes. I think a lot of people have written about Islamophobia, and there is a wonderful literature on Islamophobia these years. But what I wanted to discuss was that the concept of Islamophobia cannot be separated from the history of race, racism, and consumerism and questions of labor. So, especially slavery, indentured labor, its formation under colonial rule and in the post colonial era. So, I really to bring the concept of Islamophobia into conversation with the discourse of race, I elaborated in this essay on three things. First, I, um, I, I elaborate on the concept of Mohammedanism that is being used to depict Islam in 19th century colonial literature, and the ways in which, Islam becomes intrinsic to the culture. So, and then, how we talk about Mohammedanism and actually reducing Islam to a person, to Muhammad, and the story. The second thing, I wanted to understand that what was the relationship with Mohammedanism and Islam and Islamophobia, right? And nowadays you see that we are still functioning using the colonial discourse of Mohammedanism, right? Because the depicting the images of Muhammad and insulting Muhammad, it's just all invested in one person, so which is really interesting. Then the attribution of fetishism and primitivism has been we have contributed fetishism and primitivism to the religions of the other non-Christian, non-Judeo-Christian relations. So, and I talk about how Islam, along with various African religions or indigenous religions, has been fetishized and be considered in the literature in 19th century, 20th century by anthropologists and others as a fetishistic religion. And then I bring what I learned through the study of Persian carpet into conversation with which on how things Oriental actually became part of this irrational, fetishistic religion of Islam. Because as you know, the cleric Islam or the textual Islam is very much also against, fetishization of objects, right? Even though, we always start with the story of Muhammad, how he destroyed the, those goddesses in Kaaba and so on and so forth. So in a sense, we invested a lot of writing in constructing Islam as fetishistic and as primitive. And then I argue that the figure of veiled women became central to this form of otherness, right, vis-a-vis Muslims. And that figure is still, and how the bodies of women were fetishized, and not their work, but their bodies became fetishized, and then so how veiled woman became this icon, this signifier of Islam, right? So, and that idea, which was invested with power, now has become like part of, in the Iranian revolution, it became part of a revolutionary movement under a modernization state. The Pahlavi dictatorship, it became a site of liberating women, forced unveiling of women under modernizing state during the revolution. And then under the Islamic Republic, it became like a state mandatory thing. So in a sense, we are still stuck with colonial ideas, because once you invest power in something, then we continuously reinvest power in that and hold the ideas of unveiling living. And as you see right now, the Islamophobic ideas are constantly relying on the ideas of the Muslim women as a veiled woman, right? And then in Iran, it has become part of the state ideology as Islam understands. And we know that there is no coherent, unified understanding of modesty in Islamic discourse. There are various interpretations, there are various understanding of that. And as you know, Fatima Mernizi has written about how actually veiling was constructed by the male elite to control women, and this happened, a few centuries after, after Islam was created. So in a sense, so that image is still with us. Like that is why the French government, the first Islamophobic thing they do, they prohibit veiled women, and we are constantly referring to that image. And then the Iranian state invests its nationalism in the bodies of women, and then women themselves actually then start to play with that in their everyday life, in their lived experience. And sometimes veiling becomes a site of resistance, sometimes unveiling becomes a site of resistance, depending if you are in a Muslim minority country like France or India, or a Muslim majority country like Iran and other Muslim majorities. So, but the image, this trope, is a colonial trope. If we don't, that is why understanding colonialism is so crucial for our societies, because there's so many of these ideas, images, tropes that we inherited from that era, and that became part of the kind of revolutionary movement or social movement, and so on and so forth. So it's just, in my view, it's important to understand where this signifier is coming from, where this trope is coming from, how it's being circulated, why it's so crucial, why women's bodies are central to both nationalism and imperialism. So they're both invested in women's bodies, and then so I wanted to show how it works, and also how the idea of women and the idea of Muslims as a group, then we start to invest in the idea of Muslim Islam as one thing, as a unified thing, as a unified meaning system, right? So it's just how it works, how a meaning system becomes a cultural practice, becomes fixed and aesthetic, and then becomes part of our everyday life. And it's just because veiling, even in the context of Muslim countries, have never been homogeneous, never. And veiling, people never dressed up homogeneously. Yes, under modernizing state, we started to dictate like certain kind of, under modern, forms of femininity. However, in the villages, women wore their dressing. In tribes, women were something else. Urban, aristocracy had different. They're kind of, there hasn't been homogeneous. And by homogeneous, the colonial discourse homogenized Muslim women and homogenized veiling as a symbol of backwardness, and as a symbol of oppression, as a symbol of, submissiveness. And then, of course, then we keep investing and reinvesting in that signifier, in that trope. But for me, it's crucial to understand it as a colonial trope, and what it does to bodies. Yes.
And how it keeps circulating. Um, so I so I had also wanted to just talk about sovereignty. I mean, usually when I prepare, like when I prepared for this interview, I read, a bunch of things and by you, and then I also am thinking about things we're thinking about. I'm thinking about, you're thinking about what's going on in the world. Um, and I wanted to talk a little bit about sovereignty. We know that imperialist powers violated Westphalian and continue to violate Westphalian ideas of the nation state whenever it suited their purposes, and showed their racial capitalist colors, imperialist colors quickly after making self-serving statements, in the Versailles, before the Versailles Conference, during the Versailles Conference, during World War One. Um, in turn, transnationally oriented feminist scholars, this is where what I've been thinking about, and you specifically have developed a sophisticated critique of modern nationalisms, and me too, as grounded in gendered fraternal comradeship and modern patriarchal forms of family and social life. And I've been thinking about this because I just finished rereading Fanon's Wretched of the Earth with a reading group, very slowly in a reading group. And also we read James Yaki Sales, who is a political prisoner, a Black political prisoner, who wrote something called Meditations on Wretched of the Earth. So this is very fresh. Last night we finished the last session. Um, and we talked about, kind of revolutionary nationalism, and Sales definitely talks about gender. Um, and so, and the differences in kinds of nationalist visions, the possibilities. So I thought I wanted to kind of discuss the criticisms that feminists, which we trained in terms of nationalisms, but also how we as kind of third world, let's third world peoples, third world interested peoples, anti-imperialist peoples, how also from the Palestinian perspective, how often you've had to kind of fight against a European dominated feminist argument against nationalisms in order to articulate some kind of liberatory project that is attached to place and community and history, uh, a liberatory project, that also is anti-imperialist. And so I wanted to, just have you kind of, I don't know if we need to summarize that for people who are not necessarily familiar with that. And then where I'm interested now as a socialist, anti-imperialist feminist is, what does it mean to take sovereignty more seriously in a way that feminists really don't in our settings? And I think this seems important in terms of economic, political, social liberation in a lot of countries. We can think about Niger, we can think about so many places, Venezuela, Cuba, many places that are struggling around these questions. It's a matter of life and death. Actually, Iran too. And what I'm interested in, and I think people like you and I and others, is articulating sovereigntist ideas beyond patriarchal, beyond bourgeois family forms, and beyond the Westphalian international relations concept. And I've thought about like indigenous theorizations without fetishizing them or romanticizing them, and practices of sovereignty, or basically sovereignties that are more inclusive, dynamic, and democratic, and also connect with the land, with water, with the non human, right? With watersheds. I always think of watersheds. So, how do we balance that? Taking seriously belonging and attachment to communities, the idea that there are powers that are destructive and imperialistic, and it all can't be at the micro level, right? So I was just wondering where your thoughts are now on these questions of nationalism, gender, sovereignty.
This is Such an interesting question, Francis. And, I have been thinking about that, just feeling also constantly being stuck between a rock and a hard place, right? Especially when it comes to Iran, right? So I'm constantly feeling that I have to take positions that are going against both the hard and the rock and the hard place, sometimes more nuanced, sometimes in between them, sometimes beyond them. So it's something that we live with. But I think there are several different situations. One is the situation of, you know, those people who don't even have a nation, like Palestinians, right? So nationalism has a very different meaning in the context of Palestine versus those countries who have been able to establish a nation state, and there is a form of nationalism, there is an official nationalism at place which is ruled by the state, and what we mean by sovereignty is how a state can control its territory. It's a form of territorial nationalism that Palestinians haven't gained, right? They're still living under the colonial rule. So in that sense, this is another scenario. And then in the case of Native American, they're dealing with a nation state that is depriving them from their, their controlling their land and water and so on and so forth. So they're different ones. And as feminist scholars, we are kind of, it seems to me that it's important to think about sovereignty beyond the nation states, right? Not easy to do, because thinking about like anarchist notions of community doesn't work. Who is going to provide for the poor? Who is going to provide healthcare? Who is going, in a sense, nation states are still regulating, this. Then on the other hand, the transnational forms of governance have changed drastically since digital media. Now the states are not only the only one that are controlling their population, there are all these transnational organizations that are having an impact, and especially, in the case of Iran, those who are invested with, imperialism. There are huge amount of money invested in that, and so on and so forth. So you have another realm of governance that is along with the nation states, and then how we think about sovereignty beyond these two forces that have since 19th century, the world has been divided between nation states who are sovereign, who can control, and the state can control their territories, and the kind of imperial colonial forces that are going all over places and trying to control, and so on. So in a sense, we have to think very carefully about this situation. Do we need to think beyond the idea of nation? Maybe. Do we think about, but I am very critical of imperialist feminists, those who have a liberatory project for everyone all over the world, and those who think that what they live culturally is relevant to everybody and every culture is the same as theirs, right? It's not true. We know that by experience. So in that sense, what it means to think about land, water, environmental issues beyond what the nation states are doing. However, nation states are owning these resources. They're regulating that. They're controlling those resources, and so on. So it's a really hard question to answer, but it seems to me that it's important to not think in terms of the nation states and the territorial nation states, as well as in terms of what imperial forces are pushing us to think about. But still, however, also here I become a little bit of, of a radical feminist in a sense that, private property and women's bodies there is a linkage between them. So, and then if it's important to think about private property and women. So in that sense, our thinking about the whole question of sovereignty, because the nation states have been assigned to control the public, right? Not the private, right? Sovereignty for the nation states is meaning like controlling the thing and so on and so forth, and civic society and so on. But how about women's bodies as private property? How we should think about sovereignty and body and private property, because sovereignty, if we don't resolve questions of private, property, what is going to, it's going to reproduce. We are going to fall again into neoliberal capital or capitalism again. So there is no way of thinking beyond that. So I don't have a good answer to your question, but I am willing to learn from the experience of indigenous communities, the experience of minoritized, racialized communities that are dealing with oppressive nation states. I'm trying to understand what is happening in Iran. It's just something we need to work hard on it, because transnational feminism does not mean that we are all the same, and that was global feminism. We criticized it long time ago, right? It doesn't mean we are all the same. We are all sisters in victimhood, sisters in suffering. And whenever a woman suffers everywhere in the world, we become sisters. Like, for example, some of our feminist colleagues are constantly referring to, Jill Biden giving an Emmy to the Iranian singer after Mahsa Amini. Do we care about, yes, we should care about Mahsa Amini, but we should also care about masses of women who died because of lack of medication. Do we care about them? Do we care about those kids who are killed in Palestine? Do we care about, that kind of humanism for me is bogus. It's a joke. It's a problem. It's a problem that some of us are very proud of that. What is it to be proud of? Like, this cultures of solidarity should happen everywhere, should happen in various places, not in one place where we want to invest in it. So as feminist scholars, we have been working through this kind of convergences, complicities, but we need to think hard each time. Each time is not an easy task in front of us. For me, each time I have to think carefully. I have to examine carefully to be able to even give a satisfactory response to myself. I have to, and the work of thinking, processing is never ending. I don't want to just immediately fall into something that I haven't thought about it carefully. So, and as academics, we have the privilege. It is a privilege. I claim that privilege. I enjoy that privilege. We have the privilege of thinking and having time to think. And that is precious. So many people don't have that kind of time. So many activist groups are just taking care of what is urgent. And, I taught a class called Engaged Scholarship in Women Gender Studies, and my students worked with various NGOs and community organizations and engaged with them critically. And they learned that urgent issues are urgent issues. They're kind of somebody is dying, they have to help, and so on. But in an academic context, we have time to process that, to think that. And that was when we had a kind of a panel, a conversation between students and community organizations, representative. This was fantastic. They were not, many of these communities, they were not against theory. They said, we just don't have time to read about this stuff. Please help us. bring it to our context. Or students learn from the community organizations about what is going on around them, right? Which is beyond what their life at the university. There are people that are working really hard. They have people deprived from all their rights of, having insurance. There are so many people who are concentrate in a precarious segment of the market, and those little community organizations are trying hard to resolve some of. There are women who are being subjected to violence, some for domestic violence. They're busy doing that, but it doesn't mean that we can't think about that. And I take that privilege, and I think we have to think, and the question of sovereignty is something we have to think very carefully about that, and we have to have a feminist conversation of that, and learning from people who are, Palestinians who don't even have a nation state, who don't even have, from people who are living under, authoritarian state, people who are living also under liberal states that are coercive in other ways, that are kind of, that are manufacturing consent, as Chomsky would put it. So they're more working through hegemony and so on and so forth. So in a sense, as feminist scholars, we need to constantly think, process, engage with each other to understand it. This is a concept I would like also, like you, to think very carefully about, because I'm becoming more and more critical of Enlightenment notions of revolution, that revolution as changing, replacing one state by another, one state by another, and revolutions as geared towards the state and the change of the state. I'm kind of becoming more interested in the ideas of revolution as changing, as creating, concern for inequalities at all levels, for the environmental issues, for questions of private property, and so on and so forth. So I think those are hard questions in front of us, and being in a situation where, especially in the case of Iran, you're put into a very difficult situation, and that would require even harder thinking, exchanging, learning from each other. So and that would be my response to. But I really don't have a very good response, except that what I see happening is that the digital technologies are changing transnational forms of governance, and the nation states are no more completely in charge of sovereignty of their citizens and their territorial issues because of all kinds of security, insecurity that we are imposing that. And then, how do you deal with that? As let's say, how women who want to transform patriarchal issues and so on, how do we work with this in a way that you can gain something, and you can actually move forward. So it's a hard question, and it's a question to think hard about that.
But yeah, I mean, I do. I mean, I hope we continue to think about it. I do think we're at kind of a world historical moment in terms of shifts. I think it will take a while, and I just think that it's good to rethink some concepts, theorize them, and not only intellectually, but like you described with your students in relation to movements, in relation to organizations, in relation to various kinds of communities. Before I wrap up, I just wanted to see if you had something you wanted to add or say that I didn't ask you about. But before I do that, I want to thank you for being so generous, and for, because I loved this discussion, and I really appreciate you.
Sure. So maybe the last point is that, modernity is a very conflictual, a very contradictory project, right? And then just investing in national sovereignty suspends those contradictions and also sometimes bring it to the surface, those contradictions. So those contradictions are creating, maybe they're kind of, the idea of national sovereignty prevented us from thinking differently about, a feminist project of social change, because they're maybe a huge obstacle in thinking creatively about that. So and maybe this is actually, this could open up to more conversation on something we're both interested in. And I would be really interested in continuing that conversation, that kind of thinking, because it seems to me that we always fall into one trap. One is imperialism, the other is nationalism, and we are constantly moving between these two, which is which is suspending actually our ideas of thinking about something different. So maybe that is where we can continue our conversation in the future. But thank you so much,
Absolutely.
Francis, for great
Absolutely.
questions. Right. Thanks a
Thank,
lot. That was
thank
wonderful,
you.
actually.